Hi, everyone. This is Mike Lipkin. I am the author of You Belong Here, and I'm here with my co-author, the fabulous Dr. Diane McIntosh. And today we're going to be talking to you about a core concept of the book called Being the Keeper of the Safety Flame, being someone who makes other people feel safe, empowered, and reassured, irrespective of how you are actually feeling. Because a lament that we often hear from the people with whom we work is that they don't quite know who their boss is going to be on any given day, depending on his, her, or their moods. And so in the book, we talk about making others feel safe can never be a function of whether or not you feel safe, or whether or not you feel motivated, or whether or not you feel in the mood to uplift others. Others need to rely on you to show up in a certain way and be the person that they feel they can count on to help them deal with all the challenges and the vicissitudes coming at them. So my first question to you, Diane, is it's one thing for us to say that being a keeper of the flame means you've got to show up in a way that uplifts others. But what does it take to be someone that can somehow transcend or rise above whatever moods or whatever feelings they're having? And it's interesting, just before we started this call, Diane, you mentioned that you've had a couple of weeks, and then you mentioned a process that you go through to lift yourself up. And I think that might be an appropriate segue into the response here.
So first of all, Mike, I want to say that I would never utter the words keeper of the safety flame. That is a Mike Lipkinism, if I ever heard one. But and you can tell as you read the book what is Mike and what is Diane. But it is actually a very good way of describing what it is as a leader that you have to do. And you're not always going to be successful. And I don't know that I was particularly successful over the last 2 weeks in doing that, because it was a very difficult week. And, sometimes you have things going on inside the business, but also outside the business, family things or friendship things or whatever that can go on that can make your feet not feel like they're as solid on the ground. And so the two things that were really important to me in getting through that difficult time, because I do feel like you must create an environment where your team does feel safe, is first of all, taking care of myself. And my way of doing that is when I'm feeling awful, as soon as I can remind myself to say, yeah, this sucks right now. I know you're feeling anxious. I know this doesn't feel good, but it always gets better. It does start to get better. That whole idea of, let the anxiety in the front door, let it out the back door, but do not serve it tea. I have to admit I got anxiety. I'm worried. I'm bothered. I'm upset. I'm not myself. And then I have to let it go. I can't let it sit inside me. That's part one. And part two is, if you do have a time when you don't show up, first of all, it can't be always, but it is going to happen sometime where you're not your best. You got to own it. You got to apologize, and you got to make sure you don't do that again.
Yeah. So, it's fascinating you say that, because in any given year, Diane, I'll give 100 keynote or workshops, and inevitably I have to come clean with our viewers here that 1% of the time I'm not going to show up as Mike Lipkin. Even Mike Lipkin doesn't always wake up feeling like Mike Lipkin. And it happened to me about 4 months ago. And I had a debrief with a client, and the client told me that they were disappointed. And I just said 2 words to this client. I said, mea culpa, mea culpa. And the client was reassured that at least I got that. And then the client also relented to say, look, it wasn't that bad, but for me, anything south of a 10 out of 10 is a fail mark. So yes, one has got to do whatever one can to show up in the right way. And then one has to forgive oneself in the minority of situations where you don't show up the right way. But I want to read one sentence from this specific chapter, which is chapter number 2, by the way, called Be the Keeper of the Safety Flame. And to get your immediate response here, Diane, it's second paragraph, page 34. being the keeper of the safety flame means foregoing all excuses for not playing at your best. It means for total ownership of the moment, irrespective of your position or irrespective of your temperament, as the case might be. And so when I show up for a call like this, or after this call, I've got a coaching session, I'm burning all excuses for not showing up at my best. However, there's a very important distinction here, Diane, and that is when I say I'm going to be at my best, I don't mean the best of all time. I mean the best I can be at 1:39 on Friday, October 25. And that's my way of dealing with whatever comes at me, that I say, hey, in the context in which I find myself, how do I be the absolute best I can be? And that might not be as good as I was last week, or it might be a heck of a lot better than I'm going to be next week. It's right now. Does that make sense?
It does. And the point of not making excuses, but the reality is we are living a life beyond just work or just home, or we are affected by our environment. So
Yes.
in this moment, a lot of stuff is going on, and that is going to affect how I show up. I'm trying
Yes.
not to make excuses for that, because we all have to deal with that. The words you used, when someone says to me, well, it wasn't that bad. Oh, no,
Exactly.
wasn't that bad. That's
Yeah.
hard. That's hard. So but you do have to forgive yourself. And so you can explain to yourself, okay, this environment did not create the best in me, but
Yes.
I also am a human being. I'm going to screw up sometimes. I'm going to say the wrong thing. It really cannot be a pattern, and it is not a pattern, but I got to own it. And then I need to move forward, because if I beat myself up, I can tell you, everyone else, it continues the problem instead of saying, okay, I'm going to learn from it. And haven't we said this again, Mike, again and again and again, is stuff's going to happen in your business, in your life. And my approach is always, okay, that sucked. How do we fix it? What's the solution? How do I move forward? What did I learn from this? And it's the same in these kind of circumstances. What I learned from saying that stupid thing in a meeting that I wish I didn't say, that I can't unsay. All right, now I move forward and apologize.
Yeah, I love it. So how do I fix it? How do I learn from it? How do I move forward? And then the last word you use here is apologize. And, there are a couple ways of apologizing, Diane. Sometimes, like this happened, someone let me down the other day, and they used words like my apologies for. Well, I prefer to say, I am so sorry for, not my apologies for. No, I'm so sorry, and really owning that apology. So now we get to a Dianism. There we go. A Dianism. And you introduced me to the concept of multiple personality agility. And we lead into that with a quote from Shakespeare, who wrote in his play As You Like It in 1599, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exit and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts, or woman, as the case might be. And so talk to us about this crossover between being able to play many parts and then your concept of multiple personality agility.
I actually first came up with this concept when I was meeting patients in my practice who had been told by other psychiatrists in their life that they had multiple personality disorders. And I'm not going to debate the reality of dissociative identity disorder, but to make the point that I'm not completely convinced that this is something that should be in the DSM, but I will absolutely acknowledge the suffering of the individuals who believe that they have this disorder. What I learned from them, and of course I have always learned the best lessons from my patients, was that there's a way to manage your emotions, your distress, your trauma, by basically cutting up your world into different pieces. I'm this, I'm that, I'm the other thing, because this part of me can't cope. That's the whole concept behind dissociative identity disorder. But I think we all have a way of doing that. I have my family Diane. So I'm mom Diane, I'm wife Diane, I'm Dr. Diane, I'm, tech creator Diane, I'm author Diane. We are all these different pieces. And it doesn't mean that each one is a completely different being, but that how we approach it, the emotions around it, the engagement around it are different. So we all have these different parts of us. I don't act with you like, I often say that to my husband. Would you say that to your friend, what you just said to me? Would you say that in front of you? Right? Because we do behave differently in different situations. So I think you have to be agile and bringing out the best of yourself in each of those situations, but also recognizing that you are a different person in each of these situations.
No, exactly. And the other aspect of multi-personality agility that really resonated with me is you say that when you are with a patient and they share something heartrending with you, you have to retain your clinical approach and response to that statement and treat them accordingly. Whereas if you're with a deep friend or a family member, or with me even, well, you can tear up, you can fully express those emotions. So share with us, Diane, just your guidance in terms of not just showing up and acting differently on the outside, but being able to control even your emotional response to something. And when you can, let's call it, indulge in your emotions, and when you really have to be the master of your emotions, depending on the context and the situation and the role you're being called upon to play.
It is a tough question, Mike, actually. And I think it comes from experience and resilience and recognizing what my role is. So as a
Yeah.
psychiatrist, a person is bringing something deeply personal, sometimes very traumatic, that would make me useless if I became too emotional about it, because
Yeah.
that would put my patient in the very uncomfortable position of feeling like they may have to comfort me. And
Yes.
I do not
Yes.
want that to happen. I want to be there for them. And so I recognize, and I feel like it's some kind of a gift, that I am able to separate myself from my patient's trauma because I'm useless otherwise. This is something you've gone through, and I am supposed to be the steady hand that helps you to be able to navigate this. But
Yes.
at the same time, yesterday I was doing a podcast and I was interviewing someone. She told me a story. I told her one back and then started to cry. So it's a complete, I would never have done that in a patient interaction, but in that context, it just came, right?
Yeah.
So it has to do with our sense of our roles, our responsibility. And if you find actually that your emotion is starting to bleed into places where it should not, where it is excessive, and you feel, man, I should not have reacted that way, then it's a time to reflect on whether you need some help or support. Because if you don't feel in control of your thoughts and feelings and behaviors, you may have anxiety, you may have depression, and you may need support.
Mm-hmm. And, at should we say, at a higher level, before you are confronted with the depth of those issues, it may be a simple case of self awareness and what is appropriate in a certain situation. And in fact, what's called for. And so oftentimes in a situation, Diane, I know that I could indulge myself and that would be considered acceptable, but I would not be uplifting. I would not be motivating. I would not be inspiring people if I acted like that. So I suppose what we're talking about here is be aware of a blind spot where you may not be playing the role that would enable you to be the keeper of the safety flame, and aspire to being the person that uplifts others, which takes us to, the final part of
If
today's
I
conversation.
could I add just one thing to that, Mike, is I think we're talking to some degree about professional boundaries. So
Yes.
in my
Yes.
role as a psychiatrist, there are professional boundaries, and there's also a power differential. My
Yes.
patients know far less about me than I do about them. And that comes with a huge amount of responsibility as far as privacy and confidentiality, but also that professional role requiring me to maintain very strong boundaries. That doesn't mean that you can't be empathic and encouraging and an advocate, but it does require that I don't put my emotional burden on them. And the
Yeah.
same as a leader is that there are professional boundaries and expectations that I can't put all of the weight that I'm carrying around as a leader on my whole team. They got other things to do. So hopefully you have some really close, strong leaders that are reporting into you, or that you have a professional coach like yourself, Mike, or a therapist or a mentor that can help you to carry that burden. But
Yeah.
those boundaries are appropriate. And with our closest people, we have different kinds of boundaries, right? And
Yeah.
those boundaries come from knowledge and understanding. Your husband or your wife may go, look, I don't want to go there. Well, that's a boundary. I don't want to talk about
Yeah.
that. That's a
Yeah.
boundary. But
Yeah.
usually there's less. And you can't
Yeah.
have that same kind of boundary, that you lack of boundaries that you have with a loved one or a friend at work.
No, got it. And there's a curious paradox here, because by developing your self-awareness, by being able to be someone who manifests multi-personality agility, you then build the habit of being that way. So my default position now, Diane, is the first question I ask myself is, who do I need to be? Second question, how do I need to act? Third question, what does this other person need? And by the way, I'm not doing all these things because I'm a good Samaritan. I've got skin in the game here. So if I show up and Diane is a key stakeholder of mine, or I've got clients, or I've got business associates, I want to be that person so that I'm the one that if they have a choice, they choose to invest time with. Because frankly, Diane, and this is what I want to say to everyone watching us, we're all in competition for the right people's time. And by definition, the right people's time is always going to be an exceptionally scarce commodity. So if you practice what you and I are talking about here, the right people are going to want to give you their time. So let's.
And what does practice mean? It means you're wiring your brain. The more you do it, the easier it becomes, because your brain actually becomes wired to be that way. And I want to make clear, Mike, this is not about being inauthentic. It's not about being someone that you're not. It's about bringing the right self, the best self. And just think about how you behave in front of your friends versus how you behave in front of someone you want to sell something to. This necessarily is different, but it doesn't mean that your values, your virtues, the integrity that you have, the way that you do things in life need to be infused in both of those. But you're not going to tell a joke that you tell your friends at a bar
Of course.
in a business meeting. So
Yeah.
you bring a different self, but it's still your best self.
I love that. I love that. As you told me, and as we write in the book, neurons that fire together wire together. So you then are programming and conditioning one's neuroplasticity to respond in an appropriate way, which then leads us to the final part of today's conversation. And we have a phrase that we created, but that I endeavored to live as a mantra. And this is good news for many folks watching this. And that is, we are not judged by our feelings, but by our actions. So hopefully as folks watch us, Diane, they can see us being up. They can see us enjoying each other's company. They can see us being all into this conversation. They can see us being fully committed to somebody taking something away from this conversation that can benefit them. But you and I might be feeling horrible on the inside. So 3 things that we write about that I'll just share with the audience, and then I'm curious as to your comments. So we say there are 3 questions you should be asking yourself at any moment when you're with others. The first is, did we inspire or empower people to do something that they otherwise would never have done? And Diane, of all the conversations we've had, I think this is one of the best. And I have to believe that over the last 15 minutes or so, someone's going to do something they may not have done. So let's put a tick there.
Check.
Number two, did they feel uplifted because they spent time in our company? And of course, the answer is, of course.
Resoundingly.
And then the third one actually ties into a concept called the Net Promoter Score, which is the world's most prevalent question relating to customer satisfaction, which is based on people's experience with us, how likely would they be to recommend us to a colleague or a friend? And so the third question we have here is, based on our impact on others, would they recommend us to other colleagues or friends? And of course, Diane, if someone watches us and, gets a sense of what we're creating together, the answer would be yes. So just to repeat those three questions, did I empower people to do something they otherwise would not have done? Do they feel uplifted because they spend time in my company? And then thirdly, would they recommend me to other colleagues or friends? So just your thoughts, Diane, on this separation between what's going on the inside and what we manifest on the outside, and the impact that that has on the people with whom we spend time.
So you have no idea what is going on in someone else's head, ever. So people can say one thing and be thinking exactly the opposite, but there are those tells and the way that people are looking at you or how they're responding that help you decide. But if you're depressed or anxious, often we misinterpret those cues. They hate me, they're angry with me. So I just want to make that point that you never know what someone else is thinking. And if you're always thinking the negative, unless you're a monster, if you're always thinking the negative, that may suggest that you've got some issues with your mood or anxiety. There's two other things I want to make a point about here, which is sometimes you got one shot, the one shot to make an impression. You have that sales call, and it's really important that obviously the product or what you're trying to sell or what you're trying to move, or even if it's yourself, is a strong product. But if you don't bring your best self, you don't bring a sense of you being engaging and interested and able to listen and responsive, you're not getting that deal. So that's important. At the other side of that, though, is when you have the opportunity to know people, your team over time, you are going to screw up sometimes. And it doesn't mean you don't have a chance to go back and fix things. Sometimes that's your one sales deal and you blew it, and then you got to learn from it and move on. But for your team, for the groups that you spend time in, you are going to make mistakes. It is the reality of life. Go back, own it. And then you're going to be able to reestablish yourself in those three very important thoughts to have, questions to have in any interaction.
Love that. So, maybe as a wrap, it is, do whatever you can to bring your absolute best to the people who deserve nothing less. But being a human being, there are going to be moments where you don't meet that standard. Forgive yourself. And as we say in the book, don't beat yourself up. Build yourself up, because over time, if you show up like this, you wire the brain to condition you to show up with your best. So you're far more likely to bring your best self than not your best self. And, that's a wrap for today's conversation. Diane, as always, it's a great pleasure. It's 1:57 p.m. Toronto time. I know it's just before noon or just before 11 your time. So we're both about to head out for the weekend, and this is a great note to begin it on.
Always a pleasure, Mike. Thank you so much for the conversation.